Everybody, good morning. I'm Jude Lombardi, and I'm co-chair with Pile Brunel for the ASE Speaker Series events. And I'm very happy to present or to be a part of this conversation, which I hope will be a conversation, not just a dialogue, but a conversation with two people I recently have met. I'm looking for my notes because I didn't expect to have to introduce people. I thought
Dude, I just got a message from Jocelyn. She has an emergency. She's at the emergency vet.
Oh, God. Okay. Boy, it
So
seems
she
to
won't
be the
be
day.
here.
All right. Well, wish her well. So anyway, we're going to talk about family theories and therapies from Bateson till now, and what's new, what's old, what are we adding, what are we subtracting, where do we go from here? And I'm joined by Bethany Simmons, who is a family therapist and a professor, and also by Rosalind Jardin, who also is, both of them are trained, quote unquote trained, family therapy people and academics, and also each of them have their own private organization in which they do such work. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Bethany to, well, let me just say, when I first became a social worker, I'm a social worker by trade in the early 80s when I got my master's in social work. I ended up working with special needs children, so really emotionally disturbed kids, and ended up, actually, that's how I found cybernetics, but I did some work in family therapy during those 10 years. And have moved away, once I found cybernetics, moved away from that micro perspective into a much larger. So I'm excited to get back into the swing of listening and learning and adding to this whole conversation or dialogue around family theories, therapies, what's new. And without further ado, I turn it over to Bethany Simmons. And thank you so much, Bethany, for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting us to be a part of this conversation. I feel truly honored to be here and excited about the possibilities of what our conversation might involve and entail with other cyberneticians. This is like, for me, honestly, I'm feeling quite nervous because I feel like I'm the kid presenting their science project to NASA scientists who are then, going to use that for something really important. And so I'm not sure, what will come about in this conversation, but that's what it was exciting about it. And I'm excited to be here. So just a little bit about myself. I completed my doctoral dissertation and my degree at the University of Louisiana Monroe, where that marriage and family therapy program is solely dedicated to training systemic and cybernetically oriented therapists to think about people from a systemic and cybernetic lens. And so my dissertation was looking at the influence of Gregory Bateson's work in the development of the field of family therapy, and then across time, how his ideas influence the evolution of our field across time. And so part of what we'll be talking about is that, but also my current scholarship research interests around areas of looking at systems of oppression, looking at larger societal systems, and how do we participate as mental health therapists in systems of oppression, and how do we, what is our role as therapists in society, and training the next generation of therapists to think about how they show up and participate in very second order cybernetic ways in the systems of which they're a part of. So that's a short version, and I'll keep it a very short version about myself and sort of how I've come to be here and my passionate interests. I'll just note this too. You mentioned a group that we've created recently in the pandemic, something that's been bubbling up for me for a number of years, I would say, where I was engaging in conversations with other cybernetically and systemically minded therapists, with students, and we were getting energized about this idea of how can we make change happen? How can we participate and be agents of social change versus agents of social control. And I found myself having the same conversations, but different, of course, but same sorts of conversations with students and therapists over time across the country. And I kept having this feeling like I'm supposed to get us together, that somehow we're supposed to connect and have these conversations together. And so in 2020, I reached out to, I would say somewhere between, I think 20 and 30 colleagues that have either been former students, former mentors, current colleagues who think systemically, think cybernetically, and are implementing it already in how they are in the world, and particularly how they are as therapists in their private practice, in the community-based mental health systems, in the settings that they work in, and how are they practicing systemically and cybernetically, and what can we do if we get together and see what happens if we have conversations. So I said, you know what, we're going to meet for 2 hours and see what happens, and maybe this will be a one-time meeting and we'll never meet again. And what happened out of that meeting was this excitement that generated for us to be in connection and see where this sort of group evolves into. So we've organized ourselves as we're in the, I think, beginning phases of organization of how can we collectively gather our efforts to work in our own ways as our part in the system and our social locations to participate in cybernetic ways in the systems of which we're a part of. And so we meet fairly regularly. And what's amazing is with no set sort of plan, we had sort of like a big vision of like, let's show up cybernetically and see what happens. We have found ourselves here. So I believe that part of those conversations led to us being here today in some ways. And Jocelyn, unfortunately, I'm concerned about her, unfortunately couldn't be here, but has been the connecting sort of connector to connect us with the cybernetic group. Because one of the things that I think is really so sad and unfortunate, but also very exciting, is to get to reconnect with the cybernetic world. Because in family therapy, that is what one of the major factors that contributed to the birth, so to speak, of family therapy. And yet in family therapy, you won't find people talking about cybernetics and systems and systemic ways of working, except for a very small group of people. And in the scholarship, in the literature, you don't see people talking about therapy from a cybernetic systemic lens. Our field has really left that. And I just see this as ideas that are at least 100 years ahead of their time in being able to understand people in context, being able to understand people in relationship, and having ways of understanding processes and how we find ourselves in particular situations, in interaction, and how we make sense of ourselves in relation to each other and the situations that we find ourselves in. And I just think this is a ripe time in society. We're starting to talk about systems. We're starting to talk about systems of oppression. And so, there's a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of, I think, what cybernetics has to contribute to our understanding of ourselves and society is just like this untapped resource. So as you said, we can talk. So at that, I'm going to stop there and see what where we go here.
Bethany, what's the name of the group?
We're calling ourselves currently the Big Systems Collective. Okay. And our sort of big vision, just to share that a little bit, is that the co-creators of this group is sort of the foundational group of people sort of driving the train, so to speak. But the hope is that eventually we are in a space where we can open this up, that anybody wants to participate in being a part of social and systemic change across disciplines, not just therapists, can be anybody, any person. It doesn't matter what you do or who you are, could be a part of this larger sort of group. That's sort of the big picture. Whether that happens or not, I don't know, but that is our larger vision.
Thank you. All right, Robin, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon and good evening, depending upon your location. My name is Robin Jardin, and like Jude had mentioned, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm in private practice. And so the heart of which I come to share this space with you all today is really grounded in community. That's where my desire to work with people came, was being in community and seeing how the systems that were at play in my growing up experience were not addressing the issues and the human suffering that I was seeing around me. And so my love of cybernetics really comes into play throughout my educational experience, and really wanting to not only advocate and call out and call in systems of oppression, but really interested in dismantling. So it's like the person who participates in the creation of Frankenstein. How do I kill Frankenstein? And how do I create a new thing? Not separate from Frankenstein, but how do I morph? How do I be part of a larger group that morphs into something new, right? So where there's a death, there's a birth. And so for me, my area of passion has been into trying to understand how systems of oppression not only work on a micro perspective in terms of family and in terms of community, but also from the national and the international and global perspective. So one of the things that my work has really brought into is how we are in relationship to one another, our connection, like our fundamental needs as human beings for connection, community, and belonging, and how we have as a human group, how that's been structured over time throughout the generations, right? The intergenerational transmission, how we have dealt with our inheritance, and how do we turn our inheritance into something that is equitous. Particularly when, I'm looking at systems of oppression where the rules of the system, the roles of the system, your social location, and equity, well, it's inequitous, but our social location determines a lot of what we experience in life, what we don't experience in life, as well as how it affects our relationship with one another. So what that has done is it's turned to my research was built on wanting to understand the relationship between Black and African Americans, Southern African Americans, with in relationship to Caucasian or white Southern Americans within the context of the US history and within the context of race, because that's what our society is structured around. It's structured around the construct of race. And what those experiences were like for people within their families, because I interviewed families from a multi-generational perspective, and also what it meant between groups, as well as from the larger context view. So in my work, you see a constant, like an accordion, you'll see the expansion of looking at things from 50,000 feet to looking at things 2 feet apart, and you'll see the movement in between. So cybernetics for me has been a operational way of looking at how humans not only experience love and momentum and energy and power, but also how we experience things like exploitation, abuse, minimization, oppression, experiences of gaslighting. And so today where my heart has been heavy on is, of course, the Russian invasion, and looking, one of the things that advancements of technology has done for us is really been able to see ourselves from more of a global perspective more than ever before. It's also given us more opportunities to gaslight and to oppress and weaponize connection as a way of dealing with domination, systems of domination. So today, I come to you in a spirit, not just only as I, but mostly a we. Anything I've ever done in life or been able to experience in life has not been because of myself. It has always been in connection with somebody else. And all of the work that I do from now until the rest of my life will always be in community. So today I come to you by way of Bethany. So Bethany and I, we come from the same program, which is grounded in systems and grounded in cybernetic thinking. And I'm a part of the Big Systems Project. I'm also a member. And so the role for me is not simply to describe what happens. It's how do we as a collective activate. An individual can inspire, but the collective is what activates change. So how do we as a collective and a community bring ideas that are important for understanding, but how do we activate that for real concrete change? So I want to thank everyone, and I'm really excited to not only share, but I'm really excited to learn from the community today.
Thank you, Robin. Bethany, would you like to comment at this point? I'm just wondering if there's anything Robin said that you want to.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest contributions to something I'd like to mention about the significance of Bateson bringing cybernetics into what we now call family therapy really should have been a revolution in psychiatry. What happened was, and I'm going to be over reductionistic and oversimplifying his influence and minimizing the significance and influence of many other persons and systems systemically that was happening, co-occurring in relationship together in the development of what we now call family therapy. But really what happened was cybernetics gave us a way to understand people in more complexity. So rather than in a reductionistic way, we actually embrace the complexity of being human, and that being human means we're in relationship and we're embedded in relationship and context that we can never escape. There is no such thing as the outside observer. We're all participating all the time simultaneously. Anytime we try to suss out or create those distinctions, those are our punctuations that we're constructing. And so his bringing cybernetics into psychiatry and, from my perspective, an anthropological, ecological view of human beings started to depathologize people, because it started to look at the mental illness, what we would describe as mental illness symptoms, in a context of complex interactions and relationships, and that no person is in a vacuum or in isolation. So Bateson had government-funded research programs studying, and this is sort of the story about how our field began, studying in conjunction with psychiatrists individuals who were displaying what we would call symptoms of schizophrenia and schizophrenic communication, and started to observe them in context of their family system, trying to understand the communication patterns of what was occurring, what was transpiring that could be observed, versus at that time, the idea of the individual and what was happening internally for that person was solely internal, and we can't observe what's happening in somebody's mind. We can only see sort of the output, right, so to speak, of that. And so when they started observing individuals in the systems and contexts and relationships, they developed these ideas about understanding human beings as dynamic and as responding to the context that they're a part of. And so understanding all behavior makes sense in context, understanding that all behavior is communication. These are some of the legacies of cybernetics in in understanding human beings from a non-pathological perspective, understanding that human beings are adaptive and human beings are doing the best they can given their context. So the context creates a space for people to respond to in kind. And so I think having that as our foundation completely changed the understanding that somebody is sick or ill all inside of themselves when we talk about what we describe to be mental illness. So I think it really, a linear intrapsychic mental illness epistemology looks for pathology versus how are humans adapting and responding to what they're experiencing in a way that makes sense in that context.
That's wonderful, because when I was doing family work and work with these children, I was looking for a healthy model. And that's what I found in cybernetics was, by that time it was Umberto Maturana, Herbert Brun, Heinz and Gordon Pask and those sorts of folks, what I would call first generation, second cyberneticians, that I found. Oh my God, I didn't understand a word, but intuitively I knew I was right where I needed to be, because this was a healthy way of looking at human life. It was humane cybernetics. And the other point I wanted to make about Bateson was Mary Catherine Bateson, his daughter, who Gregory had with Margaret Mead, who was one of the provocateurs for what's known as second order cybernetics, the cybernetics of cybernetics. Mary Catherine talked about cybernetics being a very radical way of viewing the world, and partly because she thought it was one of the domains, and of course these are my words, having heard her words, she thought that cybernetics had the best chance of looking at some of these problems, very much like her father did, Gregory did. And she really wanted cybernetics, and she thought the reason we weren't embraced, as you pointed to earlier, Bethany, about being dismissed from family therapy, being dismissed from psychiatry, being dismissed in many, many disciplines. She thought it had to do with the radical ideas, in the sense of not only are these radical ideas, but they go against the hegemonic ideas of the societies and cultures and networks of cultures in which we live. So here we are trying, Robin, because this is pointing at your level, well, not level, but point of view more or less of what I heard you say earlier, in the sense of, so how does one and many address these hegemonic ideas that are literally killing us all? Mm-hmm. Not just Russians, not just Iraqians, not just Afghanistanians, to put this whole Russian thing in perspective. And what I really want to do when we talk about this, and we talked about doing this in part of the participation part of this, Robin, is to talk about not so much Putin, but about Galinsky. Yeah. About the man who is performing as if he knew cybernetics, in my point of view. Yeah. So I'd like to, at this point, if it's okay, share a piece, a 6-minute video, which is I call it Brown on Bateson, and it is an excerpt from Jerry Brown talking about the work and ideas that I think are relevant after having talked before with Bethany and Robin about this. I think that these ideas are relevant to some of the idea Bateson brought to not only family therapy, but other disciplines and areas of study that were dismissed. And I think Brown does a good job. Is that okay with you, Jill? That I do that?
Wonderful.
So let's do that right now. It's only 6 minutes. So I'm going to share my screen, gang. Okay, and I'm going to go here. And I'm going to, as Pile said, make it ready. Here we go.
So that's what Gregory did for me, and it made a great deal of difference in my life.
Now I think I would like to introduce Governor Jerry Brown.
When I think of cybernetics, I think of the Greek word, kubernos, which is the same root word as governor. So I think I am the cybernos. The helmsman. I'm steering this thing. But of course we know the governor's not steering it, because the system is not steered. I remember one time I saw Greg, I can't remember where it was, but he was kind of walking around mumbling, parts and wholes, parts and wholes, parts and wholes. And he says the part can never change the whole. It is embedded inside them.
The problem of trying to transmit our ecological reasoning to those whom we wish to influence in what seems to us to be an ecologically good direction is in itself an ecological problem.
We are not outside the ecology for which we plan. We are always and inevitably a part of it.
So we're all in this system where the ideas are feeding on the ideas that are communicated, and received, and then readjusted. And so that's how I think of my campaigns, and my communication. I think Gregory Bateson said that even Goebbels, issuing his propaganda, had to listen for the response to adjust what his propaganda is. So we're all in this system, not me really doing this, it's all this interacting elements of relationships. Sounds like that's kind of important to think about, and I'm still thinking about it. He gave me a copy of his Mind and Nature, which I lost. But I remember he inscribed it, and he said, the new only comes out of the random. Now, I didn't understand for many years what that meant. The new only comes out of the random. Over the years, I got to understand that. If it's all planned, if it's all order, there's no space for anything unexpected. So chaos precedes cosmos. Disorganization can open the way for new pathways. And being at least perceived to be somewhat disorganized, I kind of like that idea. And actually, being somewhat random is a virtue, not a vice. Because we've all got problems. And climate change, species extinction, all these different issues, and not to mention inequality that's growing. And what is the ecology of that? Another thing that I like, what Gregory said, was that you need rigor and imagination. If you have only rigor, it's death. If you have only imagination, it's insanity. So these mixtures of rigor, order, and then imagination, random, and unpredictability, these all have to go together. It's very hard to explain that. One of the essays that Gregory wrote, Steps to Ecology of Mind, he talked about I can't remember what he said, whether billions of people are going to die, or whole species, or nations, but whatever it was bad. Unless we dealt with one of these three conditions. One is population growth, another one is technological change, and the other is what he called the Occidental idea of man. Now, he says, you don't have to change all three to prevent catastrophe, but you got to change one. And he thought maybe the idea that we have of ourselves, maybe that's the idea we might change. So I keep looking out for signs. We can't use Occidental, I'm not sure what that means, but some idea of us. Now, in thinking about what's the Western idea of man, as you come across the San Francisco Bay Bridge from the Oakland side, there's an electronic billboard. It's been up there for about a month by Sprint. Nice flashes, stays there for 5 seconds. And it says, our goal is your unlimited satisfaction.
Wow. Yeah, right.
That's what it says. And I keep seeing that. Our goal is your unlimited satisfaction. So I think about that. Every time I go by that sign, I say, that's an idea that we better change. If we can change that, maybe we can save things. But that thing keeps flashing. You know, it's there, and you can see it for miles and miles.
I want a new society, a social revolution. So I need a new language.
Robin?
Oh, I just really appreciated you sharing that, Jude. There were several things that came up that I'd love to even hear from the audience to see what they thought. But when you were talking about focusing on a Zelensky and moving away from a Putin, in order for me, what came up in my body was to understand a Zelensky is to understand a Putin, because it's the dynamics on the global stage. If you know, and what came up is Putin is how NATO and the US are relating to Putin is within a first order change perspective. My thoughts. Zelensky is offering second order. And what came up, I really appreciated who put that in the chat. I thought that was so good. You're giving the background of Zelensky, Christy Lowell, giving the background of Zelensky's father and mother. And I thought, right on. So when you understand his context and his relationships and what he's pulling from, when you understand that the man speaks, he's a white male in a global community. He speaks Russian, he speaks English, he speaks Ukrainian. When you understand the ideas that have been instilled in him, it's really interesting to watch how he is fighting a war that he was supposed to lose in 2 days. And you know, we are on day 23.
Yeah.
So Zelensky is, I think, is an imperative to understand as well. But I think even just to understand too, the context of how we come, part of the issue I think with humanity is we act, particularly in Western communities, we act as though our context is temporary. And what we end up finding is we keep repeating things, right? So it's not just, this is a season, this was a chapter in a life, this was a World War I and a World War II. If we don't fundamentally make a second order change globally, the challenge used to be community or nationally. Now we're being pushed, humanity is being pushed to be thinking in global terms, how to take on global systems of white supremacy. How do we take on global systems of oppression? How do we relate to each other when all we want to do is act like it's just me and I, but I'm completely interconnected with what happens over there affects me over here and vice versa, as well as dealing with, you know, linear thinking of people dealing with issues, particularly Americans with cognitive dissonance. It's too painful for me to watch the suffering on television. Therefore, I'm going to shut it off, right? So I don't have to connect with that. So I can be in my world because it's too painful.
I don't think that's the only reason people shut it off.
It's not the only.
I think because putting that in my psyche is not necessarily.
Jude?
Spent a lot of time. I said,
I'm sorry, I didn't, it cut out.
What did you just say, Robin? I'm sorry.
It cut out. I'm sorry. Would you mind repeating?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I don't spend a lot of time watching the horror. I feel the horror. I think there's horror all over the world. I think that this particular horror, because it isn't a Western culture, is getting the attention that otherwise it's not gotten in other parts of the world. And that's problematic. But I also wanted to go back in the sense of what you said early on, in the sense of one being in first cyber order cybernetics and the other second. And in doing this little piece on Brown, it was sort of like I felt like I went from steering and navigating. Oh, that wasn't going to work. Communication and control. Oh, Bateson dismissed them as myths. And that was part of the problem why he wasn't embraced by family therapy, because he didn't want to deal with the power and control as realities that could not be dealt with through differences and interactions. He wanted to focus on the interactions. And then moving towards what I consider today to be the fundamental of autonomy and conversation, Larry Richards, that I got to through my interactions largely with you, in the sense of that has been our cybernetic, or my cybernetic evolution, from steering and navigating to control and communication, to autonomy and conversation. And that there's contexts in which each of those concepts in cybernetics are relevant. It is very important when I'm making video to think that I am control, the trivial machine, okay? But when I'm dealing with other human beings, it's a different story. It's about autonomy and conversation.
Mm-hmm. I think, Beth and I were talking about this morning about, I appreciate your journey, sharing your journey, Jude. I think that's really interesting, because I was trying to connect to, like, where am I at in my journey? And one of the things that Beth and I were wrestling with for the past 48 hours was this idea about power. Mm-hmm. And for me, I think it's important to recognize, because I can be autonomous and be raped at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the idea is, and for me, and I'm not saying that you were saying this, but for what came up with me is like, being autonomy is freedom, and being autonomous and in community is part of our humanity. And I think that's always been sort of the force and the struggle that humans deal with, is how to be innerly connected and still be yourself. But I also think,
well, that brings me up to another point where, and I want to bring Robin, Bethany in on this.
Yeah.
But this brings me up to the whole idea of what I consider performance, and back to Galinsky, in the sense of the man's got a history of being a performer. Mm-hmm. And, Herbert Brun said, performance is sharing your presence. Mm-hmm. Sharing your presence. And he goes on beyond that. But the point that in the sense of being in the process, being in the presence, and yes, he being a living system brings in that moment of his presence, his epistemological makeup, his epigenesis from the moment of conception to the moment of here now, always in a medium of one sort or another. And that, if he can be his presence, is, I think, the best any of us can do, be it if we're looking at micro change, micro, macro, or what I like to call maximo change as well. Robin, jump in. Bethany, sorry.
I think what comes up for me when you were talking about this is this idea that of the ethics of participation. This is something that a colleague and I, Anissa Pierce, I just served as the chair of her dissertation committee, where she was applying cybernetics to clinical supervision. And one of the contributions, I think, of Bateson's ideas, he doesn't talk about it directly this way, but I interpret what he's saying as we have a responsibility when we can see ourselves as part of what's happening, mm-hmm. and part of the larger whole, that in individualistic Western mentality is that we somehow are separate mm-hmm. from something that we are so embedded in. Yeah. It's almost delusional, the sort of the links that we have to go to think of ourselves as individuals, separate entities in and of themselves. We're wholes and parts simultaneously. So what comes to mind for me is this concept that she and I have been playing around with, is the idea that when we recognize that we are embedded in relationship, mm-hmm. we can't not participate. One cannot not act. One cannot not interact. Because we're alive, we automatically, to not do something is to do something. So if I sit in my chair at the beach where I live and say, I'm not, this doesn't impact me, what's happening across the world, I'm not a part of this, I'm still taking a position that I'm not going to participate, which is participating in a way yes. of of not participating. So we can't not participate and be a part of it. We can act as if that's not happening. We can look at it that way. So the ethics of participation, to me, I think Bateson, when we look at things from a second order cybernetic view, challenges us to be socially responsible for our part of what are we doing and how we show up. And this is sort of in line with my goal in training therapists is how do they think about how they participate in relation to the clients that they're seeing in the therapy room? And what is the responsibility that they have based on the power and position society has given them with responsibility to, they can relate to the clients in ways that reify and reinforce oppressive structures and systems, or they can operate in ways that promote social change and help people to have agency to also participate within the context and the limits of their context. And part of that is acknowledging the context in which people exist and the constraints of those contexts. So how we I recognize our own place in the system. What sort of power has the system in the way in which we're organized in the systems and how we are located and positioned in the systems? What can we do in our own spot to ethically show up and participate in the world in a way that is hopefully for the better of the system?
Yes, and there's two comments I want to make before we go over to Robin. And one is the issue of responsibility in the history of cybernetics and what I've been told, in the sense of that with second order cybernetics, the ethics of responsibility and ethics emerge, okay? And that there was a split in cybernetics when that happened, because there were scientists who said, I'm not, I'm a scientist and I need to be separate. And probably this is part of what family therapy theorists were thinking as well. I need to be objective, not a part of it. Whereas once you see you are an element, as Bateson said, a part of the systems that we live in, then one is responsible for one's actions, which takes me to the second thing. And this was the Irving Kaufman, I think his name was, a sociologist, who said, we are all actors acting all the time. And I would like to add, and when we act with intent, performers. So I think you have participants who are acting and you have participants that are performing. And I prefer performing whenever possible. Doesn't mean I don't act some of the time. I am anywhere but perfect. But performance in being in my presence with what I desire to be the case, knowing my desires, and that's a whole nother story in regard to desires, exercise, and people coming together and working together to share what they desire. Okay, and then my intentions automatically sort of have me perform in ways that are relevant to those desires. So that's one of the things that this whole cybernetic community and conversations and interactions have meant for me. Robin.
I was wanting to really echo some of the things that Beth was speaking about, which I thought was really important, because a lot of the work when I'm speak from an I perspective, when I'm with students as well, is actually dismantling their our own vision of who we think we are in relationship to someone else as it relates to therapists. So one of the things that I harp on is this idea, I call it something called power and privilege of the seat. Because therapists are used as elements of social control. We're used by the court system, we're used by our communities. Our voice, while everybody from an experiential point of view has the right and the autonomy to have a voice, how much you share it depends on your context. It also depends on your social location and your own choice as well, right? In addition to that, though, what I have found in my own work is the therapist's voice is seen as the truth. So if I say something to the judge and the client says something to the judge, my voice is more heavily weighted in that system. And so for me, when we're working with students, one of the biggest things I work with Beth at Cal Lutheran. She's my boss, y'all. But is this idea of really having students own, particularly white students, own their own social location as benefiting from something that they inherited, and learning how to not only decondition themselves from not acknowledging. We've been taught to not see race. We've been taught to, from a legacy perspective, from a family legacy perspective, not just a social perspective, but to decolonialize part of the gaslighting that we experience in white culture, so that they can own the privilege and the position of the seat they're in. So that way they can see how they're impacting the client as well as the client impacting them. So much of what happens in the room is students will be looking at how their clients are responding as though they have no influence on how the client is responding to them. So the idea of, and I'll be brief, Jude, because I don't want to soak up the time, but just the idea of Bateson. One of the powers of Bateson is, number one, is the power of context and seeing the interconnectedness. His work from an interdisciplinary view, how he informed 15 other disciplines, I think is very helpful in looking at things from a more integrative, complex, and contextual way. It also, cybernetics it's not the only tool, but it is an important tool to help us understand context. Because we have some pathways to understand how these interactions are working together, particularly over time. So I just wanted to kind of echo, Beth, I thought that was a really good point about how we are looking at that in terms of training our students.
I don't know if I found when I was teaching, one of the most useful tools for addressing what I heard you talking about initially was C. Wright Mills' sociological imagination. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it really is, it's about, it's a book, but the bottom line is sociological imagination has to do with beginning to see what you consider personal problems as public issues. It's a model for that transition that I have found. My desire as a sociology professor was for my students to increase their sociological imagination, to be able to see those connections between the individual personal problem and really the connections with the structures that we have constructed and co-created, and through our languaging perpetuate over and over again, that either say, I'm a part of it, or I'm not a part of it, and I don't want anything to do with it, or anything else in between in that process. Bethany. And then we're going to go, and in a minute, we're going to open up the chat, Pile.
Yeah, I don't know if I have too much more to add to that. I appreciate that resource because I'm not familiar with that. But I do think what you're talking about is, we create these distinctions to make sense of our world, and we break it down into these various disciplines. And Bateson talked about how, we really need to transcend this idea of all these things being separate. But it's because we're all trying to look at certain parts, right? Because it's hard to see the whole thing because we're in it and we're part of it. And so
we can never see the whole thing.
That's right. We can never see the whole thing. And the more that we come together with the parts, the more that we have more of a picture of the whole, but we never fully can. And because we're always constantly operating in it, it's hard to see it that way. So I think how can we, in an effort to change the system, change ourselves? Because they're recursively linked. So what I do and how I can reflect on how I participate ultimately will have a ramification in some way in the larger whole, but it's collectively to come together in this way that can shift the rules.
And I think a beautiful example is what you in your introduction made, in the sense of how you got here now.
Yeah, it's a very cybernetic example. Yeah.
And that's beautiful. That was it. And, you don't know what the outcome's going to be, but, maybe it'll be something you'll be able to be delighted about.
And that's all we can do, is that we can hope that how we show up with what we're hoping to show up with, and how we're being mindful in our participation in this way, we're hoping it makes a positive impact. But, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And that was Gregory's, I think, caution about this overemphasis on the idea of intention and trying to control the outcome, because that things are unpredictable and humans don't like unpredictability. So we try to control the things that are outside of our control, which in reality is most things. So we have some locus of ability to influence, to have a part, but it's connected to these larger pieces, to the larger communities and systems.
Yeah, and I choose to use the word intention instead of goal or purpose. Intentionally. Hile.
I think that there have been no comments at all in the chat that require people to speak up. There's been a
excellent,
nice conversation. So I'm going to
raise your hand, speak up, whatever.
How about hands up instead? Put your hand up so that we can determine when you want to have something to say. Oh, there we go. Lowell has a question. So Lowell, come on in.
Yeah, my question is why Cal Lutheran was able to preserve Bateson's ideas and progress them when other academic institutions throughout the US have suppressed and pushed out these ideas very effectively.
Well, I'm not sure that we have. We're trying. And I would say that, I really view my training at the University of Louisiana Monroe as really that womb, that systemic womb, so to speak, that Robin and I call it. Their dedication and commitment to only a systemic and cybernetic way of working and understanding people, because that view is so immersed. You're so immersed in that view. I think you almost have to be. I think it has to be immersive. And so I think at Cal Lutheran, this is the one of my colleagues, Jamie Banker, who hired me, is a systemic cybernetic therapist who also had this vision to create a systemic cybernetic training program, because most MFP training programs in the country have moved away. Even they talk about being systemic, but yet in practice, in sort of what is focused on, has really moved away from that. And I see that as a shift for various reasons. There's lots of that we don't have the time to get into, but there are lots of reasons why I think the national, even MFT profession has moved away from looking at things from a cybernetic and systemic lens. So it feels sort of like we're the last hurrah trying to hold on. That's what it feels like. And so, I think that in having these conversations with people who are really excited about these ideas, who view the world this way, who want to practice this way, generates excitement. And I think it's contagious. And so I think the more that we can gather people together to come together and share those ideas, to have these conversations, I do think it keeps it alive. And actually, one of the reasons that I moved out of private practice, and I've worked in inpatient psychiatric hospitals, both for adults and juveniles. I've worked in intensive outpatient programs. I've worked with the court system as the director of juvenile drug court, supervising clinicians in that program. And I really moved out of clinical work into academia because I felt like my sphere of influence for thinking about things this way and making change in the system has a much larger sphere of influence. If I'm training 100 students a year to think like this, even if several of them leave the program thinking about these ideas and go and take that into the community, and they're working with hundreds or thousands of clients. That's more influence than if I'm working in private practice with someone who I might impact them and the others that may be in their life as well in some way. But I think that the possibility for change is sort of how do you relate and align yourself in community in the system. So I don't know. I feel like that's a long answer to your question. I'm not sure if I answered it. I don't know. We're trying to do that, and it feels like an uphill battle, truthfully.
One of the things that I find fascinating is I think it works in your system because it's applied. Gregory always talked about cybernetics as applied epistemology.
Yep.
And that is something that is not recognized by academia because it is inherently interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary, because it deals with problems, not answers. It's a questioning process, not a city of answers.
Absolutely. And I see one of our students, Chelsea. Hi, Chelsea. I'm glad you're here. And she's saying that she was introduced to these concepts in her foundation for systems thinking, and now she can't think any other way. And that's exciting. Like, I'm excited, you know? The next generation. I mean, that's the only way these ideas will live on, right? Is if we don't keep them to ourselves. We have to pass them along. Yes.
Robin's trying to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to echo something Beth said, because I think both are necessary. For me personally, I'm moving out of academia because I find through my business, because what the birth, or what the pandemic gifted, if there is a silver lining, is I'm going to start developing classes to teach the public about systems of white supremacy, about Batesonian concepts, about cybernetic concepts, and get it out to the public. You know, if we're going to flip our culture to be more relational, then we need at least 51%. So for me, I'm trying to actually take it out, because Beth is necessary and training systems are necessary. What I'm hoping to do is to influence the average person, regardless of your education level, regardless of your reading and writing level, regardless of your ability, right? To be able, because we live in these systems anyways, but to have an accessible language, kind of back to Jude's, an accessible language for people to be able to not only decolonialize their experience, but also activate where they are at. And
you just hit on the Big Systems Collective, because that really is one of the hopes of the Big Systems Collective, is to get these ideas out there in the public, so they're not just in these ivory towers or academic journals somewhere, you know, that we are having these conversations openly and publicly. And people, I think there are people that will be, who don't know anything about cybernetics, but this will make so much sense to them because this is how things work. And I think the more that we can get these ideas out in the public sphere, you know, it increases the sort of the level of influence that has as well.
I'd like to say that it's interesting listening to both your experiences, because mine was that I too was a clinician and moved into academia for some of the same reasons you mentioned, Robin. And then got so frustrated with the structures in academia, I left academia, and for the last 10 or 15 years have been trying to do things like facilitating this conversation today and being a part of it. As a way of moving forward. And then I'm going to also plug something else. And the other thing I've done recently is I'm a beekeeper, and I'm just finishing up a book called The Bee's Needs. And I slip a little bit of cybernetics without using the word cybernetics in this book, particularly when I do, and I'm just going to share this real quickly, if I may, because I'm very excited about it. We're in the proofs at the moment, so I haven't, but for example, this was my influence of Herbert Brun, who was very influential in orienting my way of thinking. But this whole idea of the circularity of needs and making a distinction for young people to read and old people. As one person who read it said, this book is for anyone from 7 to 97, and making the distinction between needs, wants, desires, and necessities, the circularity. So yes, so I've moved into that, and I'm privileged enough to say, fuck academia. Excuse my language, but that's exactly how I felt. And to move forward with doing and working with people in ways I want to. And I really want to know how to connect with big systems, if that's something you're willing to share in the chat, Bethany and Robin.
But let's bring in some other people too.
Please.
Hugh has been having a question for a while about the cybernetics and capitalism. Hugh, do you want to pop in?
Hello,
I'm excited
everybody.
about that.
You're not alone.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious because I just think that the structure, the social structure, particularly in the West, which is capitalist, is all about conscious purpose. It's all about dualism. It's all about splitting things up and treating people and the planet as resources that can be used. How to me the big dilemma is how can we encourage the kind of change that we'd like to see, and do you think that cybernetic or systemic thinking is actually compatible with capitalism as we see it at the moment? That was all I wanted to share. And I'll pop out now. And it was nice to see everyone, some familiar faces as well. So bye.
Yeah, I love that you raised this, because in fact, this is one of the conversations that our big systems group has been having, that we want to do some YouTube videos about our conversation about capitalism, how that organizes everything in our societal system. And what are the components of how that drives and holds power and weight in how we organize in the system. The mental health system is driven by capitalism.
Exactly.
Right?
A pathological system that others, go ahead, Beth.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, I got lost. I felt like it was just you and I talking. Go ahead.
That's good.
Yeah, so I think exactly what you're raising, Hugh, is we have to look at what are these forces at the larger level organizing and structuring the very foundation of the society and systems that we live in.
Yes.
Talking about overturning capitalism in our society seems like a pretty tall order.
Oh, it is. It is a tall order without violence. And I want a new society, but I am not a fan of violence. So it's a difficult thing. And I think that Brew made the distinction between conflict and contradiction. And conflict requires a change in the system. Contradiction requires a change of the system.
Mm-hmm.
I think capitalism is a contradiction, not a conflict. And now how do we deal becomes the issue of, and I do have ideas, but I'm not going to take up the time right now with that, in the sense of how I can act and perform in daily life and through the arts in ways that might provoke the kind of change and move towards a society I desire to be an element of.
I just wanted to add to the conversation about capitalism is exploitation. So I'm going to agree with Jude in the sense of like, it is a that's why for me, I don't think personally that you can make an oppressive system equitous. That's why I don't know any other way than to evolve it into something new, right? I don't. And the other thing is too, this is where particularly I say the West, but you look at it from a global perspective, the system of white supremacy is everywhere. And one of the biggest concerns in the States is because we do have a faction of Republican Party that quote unquote is pro-Putin. One of the biggest fears from some of the leaders in the CIA is that it will spread. It is the spreading of that. And so when we're thinking about what can we do, I think one of the things that we can do, particularly people within the dominant culture that privilege the most from the culture, is dismantling our own privilege. But to dismantle our own privilege means taking our own families on. One of the things that I think hinges the system of white supremacy, which I do think is power, the other part of it is family loyalty. I don't want to lose the privilege that I have, that I deny that I have, because I'm taught that I don't have it. But I also don't want to take into account that the people who have loved me, invested in me, the reason I am even here, were promoters and perpetuators of a system that built itself and profited on the backs of others. We don't want to see our families in that way. And so I think that's something too, again, it's not a solution, but it is something that I think that we need to take ourselves on with, because we're too busy telling ourselves that was then, it's not now. We have divorced ourselves from our own impact in our communities.
I'm going to interrupt again because we have a bunch of hands up, and it'll be Christine, then I can't read my name. Yes. And then Russell and then Rita, yes.
Hi, my name's Christine Humphreys. This has been really a good timing conversation. Thanks you all for putting this on. I'm more indirectly interested in cybernetics, just a little bit about myself. I've known Judy now for, I don't know, 30 years, 20 years, a long time. And
cybernetics.
From cybernetics, we were introduced, I met Herbert Brun from the School of Music, thinking, I studied his music, his words, met Judy. And then, of course, I learned about cybernetics, met Judy just before she went to her first conference. So it was interesting. I'm an artist, I'm a composer, got my degrees in music, left the academic world and ended up in the corporate world eventually for 15 years in IT. 25 years in IT total. And my goodness, the containment that is put upon you was always the most challenging and piece of it, because it minimizes creativity. And if we don't have the ability to be creative as individuals, and ironically, I was within IT operations divisions where you need to be creative and be part of systems. And so, and I would often, Herbert was a big influence to me. So floating hierarchies, I bring these things up, and it's a hard, it's linked to capitalism. Like, I guess it was Hugh was your name talking about, oh my God. And I'm not a therapist, but I came from a pretty dysfunctional, chaotic upbringing. And I went into a state of allostatic load as I came to learn what happened to me. I had a breakdown a couple of years ago, coming back to life via creativity and practicing music therapy on myself. Yes, thank you, Judy. I see you snapping, and it's a good feeling. So I'm very excited by this, and I too would like to be learn more about this group. I did email with Bethany just a moment again. What's the name of your group? That you
Big
Systems Collective.
Big Systems Collective. I love it. Did you email me, Christy?
No, I'll do it once I get off the phone and then give you a little bit more. Yeah. So anyway, I'll stop there. And but corporate containment. And I was in a place where the CEO, there was such a disconnect. Okay, so we had the bigger insanities of what was going on in the United States government with Trump, and then the system at work where the CEO expressed the desire to have us be individually creative and be loving with one another, but with the actual practice being just the opposite. It's insanity. It's insanity. And I became completely discombobulated. And I went to many people. I had been part of at that. It was an insurance company, Care First, a not-for-profit, but still had that mindset. The mindset, and oh my golly gee, and the whole misplacement within the HR, where it's the leaders that get the priority. They would not let people go that should have been let go, that were just completely diminishing to other people's souls that worked in the workplace. Anyway, I would love to talk about how does one get within these systems, because I tried, but I was in a large company.
Sometimes
Anyway,
you have to leave.
Yeah, I did. I eventually did. And anyway, thanks for letting me ramble on, and thank you for this.
Thanks for sharing, Chris.
Yeah, thanks.
Robin.
Yeah, I first of all, I want to hear more, Christine, but I want to really echo what you're saying, because I think that is a really good example. And I think, Jude, your response to her is a really good example about, here's the problem. You can leave, but you never really leave. Yeah. And I think and particularly think about it, and it's not to be dismissed.
Yes, you're right.
Like heart to heart.
No.
Think about if you were a person of color. Thinking about if you were a trans person of color. Think about if you were, like, you think about all the other social locations, you know what I mean? And how that experience.
Think if you were gay.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I am gay, and I was one of the first associate resource group was the LGBTQ. When I found out about it, I raised my hand and became the chair. And there was these great attempts. Okay, but they were not, I tried to talk to them about usage of the word queer, and they had such a misinterpretation of queer. We're all queer, for crying out loud. And if we were all queer, then let's say that it's just a lightness, because we're all queer. You're queer to me, you're queer to me, I'm queer to you, so we're all queer. And it's like they would not use it because they had this negative thing. Mm-hmm. Academia, I left that out. I mean, I don't know.
That's another story.
Now I'm retired.
Chile, you're up.
Sorry, bye.
Yeah.
That's no apology necessary.
Yeah.
Pile.
Yes, Frost is on.
Okay. Well, I would like to say that it was very nice that you organized this thing, and because we are in a very difficult position as a world. And I would say that the thinking of Maturana helps me to find, to see the system, including the government, to see us as a system, including the government. And one thought of Maturana was, when in a system, one factor, one part is given priority or emphasized, the whole system gets deformated, how can I say it? Deformation happens. And I think this is the situation, because the government and the finance has become very prior to everything, to almost everything. I mean, economy is the measure of everything. Mm-hmm. So it's much more emphasis on it, and so we have the deformation now. And what here in Greece have done is that we organized, self-organized doctors community provides primary health care for refugees and poor people, which is free. Mm-hmm. And self-organized, as if trying to say to people and to ourselves, not to think that from we depend on state for everything. We can do things on our own, you know, to get out the state as organizing principle from our minds. This is one thing I want to say. And the second thing I want to say is that there is a term coined by Rothman, which is the implicated subject. Mm-hmm. He means that we are implicated in mechanisms that produce inequality and exploitment by working, by believing things, by talking. And it's very, very useful to have this term, I think, to find our position, how we populate the system, the mechanism of the system. We need that thinking in order to find personal things. For example, as psychotherapist, I know that giving diagnosis all the time, I make people believe in science more, you know, depend on the expert and losing their belief in their own power. So I'm part of this empowering, process that is going on in the world. The people are powerless and the government is powerful. So it's what we do as people. We really, we are, what's the word for that? Yes, we transmit all what is capitalistic values. Mm-hmm. We do it. For example, I think that in children, we treat to children in very capitalistic terms. They must be resultive. They must know 3 languages. They must be very efficient. In all these measures, all these values come from that. I mean, and we are seeing each other in this running mothers with children, and nobody wants to get out, as if we'll be alone, all the others will be run forward and we are left behind. So it's very important, I think, this notion of implicated subject. In what way you are implicated in all this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think what I hear you describing is we can't escape these systems that we're a part of, or the constructs of capitalism. We can say all day long that it's a bad that it is a bad thing that capitalism is operating, and yet we're dependent. We also have to function in that system, or we can't exist and survive because we're in the capitalistic system. So, how do we change from within when our survival is predicated on the system functioning that way as well? I think it creates these paradoxes, and I heard this in what Christine was talking about with corporations as well. It creates what we call in family therapy double binds.
Yeah.
Where no matter which way you go, there's a negative consequence and you can't escape the field. And the only way to break that is to comment on it. But, how do we do that? We're doing it in a large way, right? we're trying. We're doing it here. Yeah.
We're talking about it. And that generates thoughts, and then people take these thoughts and do what they will with it, because we don't have control over what people will do with it. We can orient, we can invite, we can provoke, but this idea of power and control are the illusions that belong to the capitalist system.
We've come close to the end of our session, so
we should go to Rita. Let's let Rita say something.
Yeah, and in fact, I just did this. I just cut myself off and away from any capitalistic and corruptive and for profit way. I'm a clinical psychologist from Italy and a marriage and family therapist from this country, and whatever. And I'm also a mindfulness, trainer and meditation teacher and so on. And I just decide. I created this website that is called The Way of Love, and I'm offering all my services on a donation basis. And I don't deal with insurance, with the corporate world that decide, that force me to put a diagnosis and have a certain time and certain labels on people and so on. People just call me or have Zoom sessions, and they put a donation, whatever it might be. Of course, you can imagine my income is, below poverty level. And yet, I think this is what I need to do, to not to fall into the trap of, for profit, money, hungry, materialistic, tendency, and the perpetuation of oppression and power and control and capitalistic ways. But I am alone. I feel very much the burden of all this, but I feel free because I said no to all that, and I don't deal with that anymore. I have no desire anymore, but I'm very isolated. I feel isolated. Today, just talking to you, it was wonderful, so inspiring. And but how do we go from here?
Yes. Yes. All right, we are running out of time, so I'd like to offer Robin and Bethany 2 minutes each to, or around that, you know what I mean.
Yeah, I'll be really succinct. I think one of the biggest takeaways that it's just been re-edified in my own spirit in this is that, to me, the vehicle is connection. I don't mean to oversimplify. If we're going to change systems, it is connecting with the self while in relationship and connection with others and within community. I think Rita brought up a really good point. It can be very lonely when you are when you are trying to be a part of what's changing within a system. I think what flips a system is when you get a majority, a simple majority, 51%. So I think the more that we can be in community and operating and activating within that community, I think that's what changes the systems on the structure. So Zelensky it's not Zelensky that's just changing. He's a vehicle. He has a whole group of people behind him. And the thing that got him there was his ability to be relatable and his ability to connect and communicate. The same thing that was the element that was to disqualify him from being president is the thing that's helping him lead his country globally. Thank you all so very much for your wisdom.
Oh, Robin, thank you so much. Really, it's a pleasure meeting you, and I hope it's just the beginning.
Yes.
Bethany?
That's what I was going to say. This has just been such a pleasure and exciting for there to be so many people here interested in wanting to have this conversation. And I wish we had more time because I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts and for us to continue having these conversations. So my hope is that this isn't a one-time conversation, but that we're working together in these ways to how can we collectively bring our efforts together in shared community and continue to stimulate and provoke ideas and change and hopefully perturb some systems while we're doing it.
And I would like to offer each of you, presenters, a 1-year membership to the American Society for Cybernetics, where you might so that you can come and join us in conversation and participate. Where's Art? He's here. Art, did you get that? He's our treasurer of sorts. Well, is he our treasurer still? No, he's not. But Art can make the connection to the treasurer because we have connections.
Dude, that means so much because academic pay isn't that great. So
I understand. Right.
Art, please renew me.
Oh, there you go.
I would be honored, and it's such an honor to be in the presence of other cyberneticians. And Jude, thank you so much for organizing this, and you conversations that we've had over the past year have just been such a pleasure. And I'm looking forward to our ongoing relationships.
I'm definitely interested in the Big Systems Collective and learning more about that.
Oh, good.
Sure. And I think, Robin, just to point out what you said, what you think is the way to go. And then there's what I think is the way to go. And then there's what Bethany thinks, and Rita thinks, and Frozo thinks, and Madeline thinks, and Larry thinks, and Susan thinks. And if we could all come together in mutual respect, the love, biology of love, Matarana, if you will, and have this conflict and difference and work through these ideas, collectively, maybe we could make a difference that makes a difference.
Absolutely.
Think of Bateson. Thank you all so very much. Participants.